Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're unpacking a really complex, deeply devastating, and honestly an absolutely pivotal moment in modern African history, the Nigerian Civil War, or as you might know it, the Biafran War. We're going to look at the tactical decisions made on the ground, the unprecedented global humanitarian response that followed, and some fascinating, yet incredibly tragic, long-term biological and political data. It really shows how a conflict like this casts a shadow for literally decades. Let's get right to it.
1 to 3 million. I mean, just pause and think about that number for a second. That is the staggering estimated death toll from this conflict, which raged from July 1967 to January 1970. But here's the absolute most crucial piece of context for our explainer today. The vast majority of these casualties, they weren't soldiers dying on a battlefield. They were civilians, and they died from starvation. To really grasp how a civil war mutates into a famine of this massive magnitude, we've got to look at the core military strategy they used.
Section 1. The blockade of Biafra. Starvation as a weapon.
So, when the southeastern region of Nigeria declared itself the independent Republic of Biafra back in May 1967, the Nigerian federal government didn't just respond with a massive military offensive, they responded with a tactical blockade. And this blockade was designed to be absolute. We're talking cutting off all foreign currency transactions, completely shutting down telecommunications, and using the Nigerian Navy to lock down the entire 200-mile coastline while the Air Force blocked the skies. Now, why was this so deadly? Well, the Biafran region relied heavily on yams and cassava. Those are great for starch, but really low in protein. So completely cutting off outside food triggered an unprecedented protein shortage. This sparked a devastating epidemic of severe malnutrition, most visibly a condition called kwashiorkor, which just absolutely ravaged the civilian population, especially the kids.
Now, what's really interesting here is this cold, tactical, military justification from Obafemi Awolowo, the vice chairman of the Federal Executive Council and Commissioner of Finance. It perfectly, and honestly quite neutrally, illustrates the government's position at the time. Under the international rules of war back then, starvation actually wasn't prohibited. From a purely military standpoint, feeding the secessionist territory meant you were basically supplying the enemy's army. But the reality on the ground? It was a catastrophic, completely overwhelming civilian humanitarian crisis.
Section 2. The Asaba Massacre, October 1967.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because to truly understand the civilian experience of this war, we really need to zoom in from that macro-level blockade to the immediate micro-level violence. And this timeline is just harrowing. On October 5th, federal troops entered the town of Asaba. They claimed the civilians there were Biafran sympathizers, and they just started ransacking homes. Hoping to put an end to the violence, local leaders actually organized a gathering 2 days later. On the morning of October 7th, hundreds of men, women, and children put on these ceremonial white outfits and paraded through the streets chanting "One Nigeria" as a peaceful show of support for the federal government. But when they got to a village square, troops separated the men and teenage boys from the women and children. Machine guns were brought out, and the troops just opened fire.
While the exact death toll has never been definitively calculated, estimates range anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 people dead in that single event. The aftermath? It left the entire town decimated. The military occupied Asaba for months, destroying property and causing massive displacement. The civilians who actually managed to survive didn't even return until the war ended in 1970. This kind of immediate, localized violence, coupled with that widespread famine we talked about, created a massive global shockwave.
Section 3. The Great Biafran Airlift, the world responds.
Because of global television, the Biafran War was really one of the very first times people around the world saw the raw reality of famine broadcast directly into their own living rooms. And because the UN and a lot of national governments were pretty reluctant to intervene, mostly because they officially considered it an internal Nigerian affair, a huge, diverse coalition of religious and non-governmental groups stepped up. We're talking groups like Joint Church Aid, Catholic Relief Services, and Oxfam banding together. They ended up forming what would become the largest civilian airlift in history, completely defying the federal blockade to get food and medicine to a starving population.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer mind-boggling logistics of the operation. It required a massive, decentralized global effort. You had the US providing funding and military cargo planes, Canada sending Hercules aircraft, and France quietly slipping in aid. And honestly, most incredibly, they used neutral island airstrips in places like Sao Tome to fly directly into Biafra. They flew over 5,300 missions into basically a widened road called the Uli airstrip. And get this, they flew at night
without radar, and without landing lights, just to avoid the Nigerian Air Force. They'd hover in the pitch black until a ground crew briefly flashed lights to signal them down. It was an absolutely astonishing feat of civilian bravery, and it saved an estimated 1 million lives.
Section 4. Intergenerational Scars of War, the Biological Legacy.
You know, we so often think of a war ending the exact minute a peace treaty is signed. But the biological legacy of Biafra tells a completely different story. A groundbreaking study from the IZA Institute of Labor Economics provides some of the first real evidence of these intergenerational impacts. The researchers tracked the long-term economic, educational, and biological data of the folks who survived the famine. So the crucial point is what they found about the women who were between the ages of 13 and 16 during the war. Exposure to the famine was particularly devastating for them because adolescence is this highly critical window for a second growth spurt. Women exposed to the famine ended up being on average 4.53 centimeters shorter in adulthood. Not only that, they were 41% more likely to be overweight later in life, and they had significantly lower educational attainment compared to women who weren't exposed to the war. It permanently altered their biological development.
But the tragedy didn't just stop with them. It actually passed down to the very next generation in this horrific biological chain reaction. A mother's adolescent exposure to the war and the famine directly impacted the survival and the growth of her future children. Kids born to these women faced a 1.5% increased likelihood of neonatal mortality, a 2.1% increase in infant mortality, and for those who did survive, a 14% increased likelihood of child stunting. So the starvation of the 1960s was literally biologically scarring children born in the 1980s and beyond.
However, the data does offer a really important note of hope here. Targeted post-war government policies actually worked to rebuild some of this damaged human capital. In 1976, Nigeria instituted the Universal Primary Education Program. The study found that exposure to this free primary schooling initiative mitigated the adverse impacts of war exposure on education by almost 70%. It's a powerful reminder that the right policy interventions following a massive shock can successfully offset a lot of that long-term damage.
Section 5. No victor, no vanquished. The political fallout.
Okay, so we've seen the biological legacy, but now we have to look at the enduring political legacy. At the very end of the war, in January 1970, the head of state, General Yakubu Gowon, delivered a very famous speech declaring, "No victor, no vanquished." It was a highly critical rhetorical effort designed to rapidly re-immigrate the defeated Biafran region right back into the Federal Republic of Nigeria and kickstart the healing process. The government made it crystal clear, national reunification was the ultimate goal.
But as you can probably guess, the modern reality is highly complex. More than 50 years after that speech, academics and analysts note that the Southeast geopolitical zone still grapples with the fallout. There are ongoing struggles for political inclusion and a really strong sense of perceived economic marginalization. Issues like the abandoned property saga, where properties owned by Igbos fleeing the war were seized and just never returned, those remain unresolved sores to this day. And this lingering bitterness, it's fueled a modern resurgence of separatist groups, most notably the indigenous people of Biafra, or IPOB. The social inequity still poses a massive challenge to national cohesion.
Which brings us to a really provocative question I want you all to walk away with today. When does a war truly end? Because as the source materials in this explainer have brilliantly illuminated, it is definitely not when the last bullet is fired. Between the biological scars passed down from mother to child, the historical trauma of tragic events like Asaba, and the deep political fractures that still shape modern Nigeria today, the timeline of the Biafran War stretches decades beyond its 1970 ceasefire. Understanding all these layers is absolutely key to understanding both history and the future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity, and I'll see you next time.